Two men who share a deep interest in the economic impact of climate change are Paul Gilding and Thomas Friedman. Sustainability consultant Paul Gilding is a former CEO of Greenpeace International and is also the author of The Great Disruption: Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. He joins us tonight from Hobart. Thomas Friedman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times and is the author of several books. His next, which will be published a little later this year, That Used to Be Us: What Went Wrong with America and How It Can Come Back. He'll be in Australia to speak at the Sydney Opera House in late July. He joins us tonight from Washington. Good evening to both of you gentlemen and welcome to Lateline.
Great to be with you.
Evening.
If climate change is like a car trip where the scientists have given us the ultimate destination and the question is, are we there yet? Paul Gilding, are we? Are we at the tipping point?
I think we are, and I think there's only time to take kind of diversionary action. It's too late not to have an accident. We're going to have the crash. The only question is how severe is the crash and what will our response be in the process of slowing down. So is it fatal or not is our question to answer still, but certainly it's too late to avoid the accident.
This is what you call the Great Disruption?
That's right, and I think it's going to be a great disruption. I don't think it's the end of civilisation or of humanity, but it's certainly the end of our economy as we know it, and it's the end of this idea of endless consumerism, economic growth just going on endlessly, to the point of absurdity in terms of our lifestyles, but also to the point of absurdity in terms of our expectations that the planet can support that economy any further. And I think we're now seeing the numbers stack up in terms of what the consequences of that are in terms of resource pricing, oil pricing, arable land and so on. And so this will translate now into economic impact rather than just environmental impact.
Thomas Friedman, is Paul right? Is economic growth as we know it dead?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. We've been kind of locked on a growth path of building more and more stores to sell more and more stuff to be made in more and more Chinese factories powered by more and more coal, so China could buy more and more T-bills to be recirculated back to America to build more and more stores to sell more and more stuff powered by more and more coal, so China could earn more and more dollars to be recirculated back. We've been kind of in that loop, and basically that loop is what we're seeing slowly grind to a halt here. We just can't keep it going that way. My friend Rob Watson, who's the founder of Green Buildings, likes to say that Mother Nature, she's just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up, you can't talk her down, you can't sweet talk her, you can't say, Mother Nature, we've been having a bad recession. Could you take a couple of years off? She's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And Mother Nature, to put it in American baseball terms, she always bats last and she always bats 1,000. So do not mess with Mother Nature, and that's exactly what we're doing.
You talk about this loop grinding to a halt, and I remember vividly in 2008, and this was when you wrote that there had been this clash of Mother Earth and Father Greed. They hit the wall at once. But back in 2008, we talked a lot about this, about how we all bought too much stuff. We were way too materialistic. We depended too much on accumulating, and everyone talked about how that would come to an end. But what happened? Markets recovered, people felt more confident, they started buying more stuff again. So was it really a moment when Mother Earth and Father Greed clashed, or was it really just one of the many moments that we have in the cycle that is the great economy?
It's a good question, Ursula. The way I put it at the time was that it was our warning heart attack. It was Mother Nature and Father Greed basically saying you are growing in an unsustainable way. You're growing based on situational values, do whatever the situation allows, rather than on sustainable values. Grow in a way, and we can continue to grow in a way, but do it on the basis of sustainable values that sustain. And so I think that's really how I look at what we call the Great Recession.
Paul Gilding, where do you see these signs that we're grinding to a halt? Talk us through what you're seeing.
Look, I think one of the most dramatic ones we're seeing lately, and financial commentators are starting to discuss this now, is that commodity prices, which have been going through a pretty steady fall since the turn of the last century, so for 110 years or so, we've seen a consistent decline, averaging about 1.5% per year, 70% over that time frame. And they've only really gone up during periods of extreme demand, so World War I, World War II, sort of price shocks have seen it go up, otherwise they've gone down. Those commodity prices have now gone up again during a recession. And so, of course, what that means is that the prices are going up because demand is outstripping supply. And this is not just one or two items. This is like the entire range of commodities across food, minerals and so on. So, of course, that's in a recession. What that means, of course, if we could get the global economy really growing again, then, of course, those prices would then spike and would stop growth again. And I think that's probably the biggest example we've got. And those resources, those commodities are actually coming from Mother Nature. And what we're now seeing, of course, is that now we're running right now at about 150% of the sustainable capacity of the planet. And we plan to grow the economy to 3 or 4 times this size by 2050. It's just not going to happen. Not because we don't want it to, not because it wouldn't be nice or because polar bears will die, because physics and chemistry and biology, as Tom said, I mean, it's just not physically possible for that to occur.
But let's look at Australia right now, for example, and certainly we have a two-track economy, but what many people see is that commodity prices are high, and indeed they're driving growth, they're driving employment, so those people who are employed can buy more, that gives more people jobs. It seems to be a positive cycle for Australia. It's hard to sort of come to this point where it is all necessarily unsustainable.
Well, it's positive for Australia in the short term because, of course, commodity prices going up is good for Australia. But the bottom line is that is only going to get worse globally because, of course, the more commodity prices go up, the inputs to our very consumerist, very material economy are no longer affordable. And so, as we've always seen, when oil prices go to new highs, we get a recession as a result. And with peak oil now coming on board as well, I think we are going to see, absolute fundamental limits to economic growth. Now, of course, I don't mean 1 or 2% this year, next year, but the basic model, which assumes that we're going to grow the economy and keep on doing so until everyone in China and India and everywhere lives like we do, it's just not possible. You can't have an economy that big because there isn't enough room on the planet for it. Of course, during the cycle of getting there, there are good times, bad times for different countries, but we're looking at the total global growth model here, and it just no longer adds up.
Thomas Freedom, to what extent, though, and I will put this to Paul in a minute, is Paul's point relying on no change? Because you wrote back in 2009 that people were already using the economic slowdown to retool and reorient their economies, and you made the point that Germany and Britain and China and the US were all putting in place stimulus packages that revolved around investments in clean power. I mean, do you believe the world can come back from the brink, that people can change?
I certainly do, provided that we face up to the problem. You know, Ellie, my last book on this was called Hot, Flat and Crowded, and whenever I talk to people about that, I'll hold up the book and say, well, maybe you don't believe in hot, maybe you don't believe in climate change and global warming. No problem. That's between you and your beach house. But please, please believe in flat and crowded. That is, the world is getting more and more flat, that more and more people can see how we live, aspire to how we live, and live like we live. In my country's case, in American-sized homes, driving American-sized cars, eating American-sized Big Macs, and there's going to be more and more people. We know that. So when flat meets crowded, more and more people who can and aspire to live like us, that only goes one way toward the kind of explosive demand on resources that Paul just discussed.
I'll come back to the US in a minute, but Paul, what about all the work that is being done? I mean, look at China, for example, and its most recent 5-year plan and the commitment there to renewable energy, the massive solar farms that we see in Portugal. Do you dismiss all that sort of thing as being just not enough?
I dismiss it not as being not enough, but not being fast enough and coming too late. So it's not that it's not possible to do this differently. The trouble is we have left it so late we can't do it now fast enough to prevent a major economic crisis. So I'm absolutely very excited about solar power, about the incredible transformation we're going to go through. And I think we're going to do that with incredible speed once we start. And I refer to this kind of as the 1 degree war, that I think we are going to mobilise as we do in war to stop climate change and to turn this around. However, we have such an economy built upon the old model, it's simply going to take several decades to turn that around. So even with the warlike mobilisation and the complete transformation of transport, energy, agriculture and so on, it's going to take some decades to get there. And in the end, we have to face up to the fact that the very basic idea behind our model, which is that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet, is simply not possible. So we can argue the timing and the transition points and so on, but the bottom line is we can't get there and keep on doubling the economy every 10, 15 years into the future. At some point it must stop. And so we will see dramatic change. Don't get me wrong, I'm very excited about how fast that change is going to occur and how we are going to have to think differently about consumerism and the quality of life being defined in different ways. And we can do all that. but we have to face the fact that we're not going to change until the crisis hits. And once the crisis hits, there's a lag in the system, which means it will take some time to transform. And during that period, and I think for many decades thereafter, we're not going to see economic growth at any significant scale, and that's going to put, you know, a grenade into the glasshouse in terms of our politics, in terms of our society, in terms of our assumptions about how we live our lives and what works and what doesn't work in terms of our economic system.
Well, when it comes to things that are unsustainable, Thomas Friedman, I mean, look at America and look at the public debt, $14.3 trillion, 100% of GDP. And I spoke recently to someone in the US who said that, yes, people are concerned about it, but then very quickly they move on to wondering what's for dinner. It's almost like out of sight, out of mind. How sustainable is that sort of position in the US today, and how active are your politicians at being able to not just talk about it but do something?
We're actually going backwards, Ali. You know, in the last 2 years of Obama's presidency, climate change actually became a four-letter word. We have a two-party system here, one where Democrats have the right convictions about climate change but have no courage of their convictions, and the Republican Party has gone completely overboard on this issue. They've actually gone to war against physics. They've actually gone to war against biology and math as well. But so that's our choice right now. People who have the right ideas but are cowardly, and people who have completely the wrong ideas. I mean, we have a leading Republican presidential candidate, Tim Pawlenty, whose position is that we're going to have 5% growth for the next 10 years once we elect him as president. I mean, they're just in Crown Cuckoo land. We haven't become serious about this at all, and Obama has not used his bully pulpit. Climate change became a four-letter word under Barack Obama because it is such a hot political topic here that everyone tells him you've got to stay away from it, and he's presided over, I think, a real erosion in American understanding of this issue.
So, Thomas Friedman, when do you think that we will know that we've got to this crisis point that Paul Gilding talks about, that will lead to this extraordinary action that Paul also talks about, and I'll get him to expand on in a minute, but when do you think we'll know that we're there?
Well, Ali, basically what's going on right now is we're all sitting around waiting for the perfect storm. And the perfect storm is a storm that is big enough to finally end this debate, but not so big as to end the world. That's basically what we're sitting around waiting for. And so politicians aren't actually going to take the action we need. They're going to wait for the market and Mother Nature to act, okay, and force us to do this. Now, you know, when Mother Nature acts, you know, it's like we have a choice. We can go to the dentist and have him remove our rotten tooth, you know. It'll hurt, but they'll do it with Novocaine and it'll be done in a professional way. We're not going to do that. We're going to let Mother Nature do it. Now, when Mother Nature does your dental work, that's like having a caveman remove your tooth with stone tools. He'll get it out, but there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor along the way.
Paul Gilding, is that right?
Yeah, totally right. And it won't just be environmental, it'll be economic as well, and therefore it's social. So as oil prices go up, therefore food prices go up. As food prices go up, instability goes up, as Tom wrote about in his column last week. And so you have this cycle that goes on, and that's what's going to happen, because it's a complex system. It's not just a major climate event. It is food prices going up, food shortages and famine, creating political instability, which is bad for markets. Markets get nervous. You know, for example, if we want to achieve a 2-degree temperature rise and no more than that, and we want to have an 80% chance of achieving that, it means that between half and three-quarters of all proven fossil fuel reserves, all coal, all oil and all gas, can never be burnt. Now, those companies are valued according to their assets, and those assets can't be sold. So we're going to have a massive economic shock. And I think the economic shock is what is going to drive us to change rather than environmental impact. We've had the most extraordinary extreme weather in the last decade. I mean, any right-minded person looks at that and says, what are you thinking? Of course there's a climate change already happening. We're still not responding, so more of that isn't going to help.